Okay, everybody. We're going to be talking today about manifest destiny and this thing called the market revolution. The market revolution is part of this era because it is a change in the nature of the economy of the United States. And that means not just the economy, but it's a change in the nature of the class systems as well. And so when we talk about a market revolution, we mean that there are more markets for which people can buy and sell and work in. So in the 1870s, a painter slash author put this painting together and called it The Triumph of Manifest Destiny. Now, this painting is something we like to talk a lot about as historians as being a great mural that shows what Manifest Destiny was kind of envisioned as in the 1870s, which was arguably the time when the period had kind of matured, that the era of westward expansion, where by the 1870s, westward expansion was no longer happening. It was just people filling up the spaces that have now been taken. And so in this image, you've got a lot going on here. And in any class, I would normally spend some time on this. It's a little harder for a recorded lecture. But if you look over here, you see bison. Over here, you see Native Americans. I want to draw your attention to the fact that this is all very dark over here. Right, there's this darkness that would be termed by somebody in the period as being savage or uncivilized. That's what's happening here, and that's why these guys are all running to it. The savage and uncivilized and untamable are running away from the light. What is the light? Well, it's American progress is what this is basically telling us, right? This is kind of a piece of propaganda if you really want to look at it that way. So you've got Americans who are moving westward as frontiers people. You've got Americans who are in these wagon trains moving westward to set up early farms in places like Kentucky and Kansas and Nebraska. Way over here, you've got a member of the Pony Express, which was an early mail system. Over here, you've got the stagecoaches, and stagecoaches showed up when you had a town out in the West that was surviving, that was thriving, because stagecoaches were sort of like the limousine of their period. If stagecoaches were showing up in your town, people with money were in them, and that was a big deal. Right here, of course, farmers, and maybe most importantly is you've got technology, which is how you're going to connect 3,000 miles of continent together. This is a huge country. And so you can't have people moving westward away from the cities and be profitable and marketable and able to earn a living unless they can be connected to the cities somehow. And that's how the trains are going to play a role, as well as the telegraph is being held by this thing, right? Way over here, if you look really closely, you can see an actual city. And that's just any city, right? That's Chicago, Detroit, New York, it doesn't matter, right? It's just a big city. And that's where all these people are moving from as they find opportunity further west. And to move west, they've got to move the savagery away. And so that's part of the moniker for the era. The gal that we're looking at here, she shows up all over the place in American propaganda pieces before the really World War II. She's around, and you'll see her everywhere. You recognize her maybe, well, maybe not here unless you've read this stuff, but she's here actually talking to Americans about the need to support Dred Scott in a court decision. It's just a newspaper propaganda piece. Over here, she's encouraging Americans into the War of 1812. Over here, she's encouraging Americans into this thing called the Spanish-American War. Over here, you see her embodied as Lady Justice. Over here, of course, your famous Statue of Liberty. Over here, you see her used as propaganda because she embodied America at the time. Still, who is she? She's Lady Liberty, or Columbia is the actual name, by the way, of this gal. Her name is Columbia. And the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., was named after her. And this is at a time where nations like Britain and America and France were all using characters to kind of show who they were. And so France had Britain had Britannia. America has Columbia. The French, I forget who they had, but they had somebody too. And they'd always show up in all the propaganda and all that, right? But before there was an Uncle Sam, there was Columbia. And so you see her here during Lincoln's electoral process saying that voting for Lincoln was like voting for George Washington. You see her here, of course, as Columbia Pictures, which this was an American company that came about to do black and white early films at the time where people were still talking about America's manifest destiny, telling the tales of the Old West and the tales of frontiers people like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone and so on and so forth. I think the irony of this is that today, this symbol of Columbia that's so recognizable today, the symbol of manifest destiny, of American exceptionalism, a westward expansion, is now owned by Sony Pictures in Japan. I think that's it's almost sad and hilarious at the same time. And then you see her here telling people to get into the U.S. Army, because, hey, what the heck? So the deal is that this is this era that we're talking about of manifest destiny, all being overseen by the spirit of American progress by Columbia, who is holding a book, just like the Statue of Liberty and all that, right? Always holding a book, which is a symbol of civilization. Those who can read are civilized in some people's way of thinking. And then you've got this, right? You've got this telegraph wire that she's holding. And sometimes she's holding a sword, and sometimes she's holding a torch, but she's always holding something. Okay, so a little bit about Columbia then. Well, that brings us over here. One of the things that's going on between Americans' War of 1812, so around 1812, 13, 14, 15, all the way through the 1840s, is that a number of Spanish colonies are declaring independence from Spain. And so you've got all these territories from central North America all the way down into South America, and they are fighting for various forms of independence from a very weakened Spanish empire. And so they're doing it. Now, the United States wants to get involved in this, not by really helping these guys fight, although the U.S. does at times help a little bit, but the United States wants to make sure that Europe does not take advantage of these weakened colonies that are trying to turn themselves into countries and send their own armies of conquest over. This region, guys, all of Latin America, is loaded with resources that industrializing nations need, from labor to salt, to gold, to silver, to rare earth metals, to coal, so much more. Farmland, right? Everything you need, oil in some cases. And so this is all resource rich. So if you're in Europe and you're noticing that Spain's power is eroding here and that the colonists are fighting for their independence but are still weak, well, then if you're France or you're Russia or you're pretty much anybody else, this is an opportunity for you to send an army in and take over where Spain had left. And so Europeans were working on doing that. And the United States was just coming out of the War of 1812 at the time. And so the very first foreign policy when it came to Latin America was published in 1815. And so this is something the U.S. is worried about, Russian and French, a little bit with Britain, but not as much, but mostly Russia and France. America is concerned about because Russia was already going into California over here, already doing that and setting up forts. And of course, France is already looking at Mexico all the way down to Peru. Russia was looking at even further down this direction. And so the deal is the United States at some point wants to go, remember this picture? The United States wants to expand across the entire continent, and it's going to be much harder for them to do it if all this territory west of the Mississippi River is owned by major nation states like Russia or France or even Spain. And so the idea is we need to keep those guys out, right? We need to let these territories become independent because that means the United States can have an influence here and even take some territory, as in the case here in northern Mexico at the time, which will one day become U.S. territory, because it's much easier for the United States to fight these guys than to fight major world powers. So the United States is going to issue a doctrine, and the Monroe Doctrine is this. The United States would oppose any intervention by Europeans in Latin America. So that's the Monroe Doctrine. Now, this is not something that Europeans would take very seriously because the United States was still pretty weak. It's just this. The United States and Britain are going to combine together to defend the Monroe Doctrine. So the British Navy and British foreign policy is going to really protect this. Why is that? Well, it's because Britain already has an interest here. And so the United States wants to have control of Latin America, and Britain already has a little bit of control of the Americas. The British are already in Argentina, and the British are in the Falkland Islands, and the British are up in Canada, right? So the Monroe Doctrine is just essentially the British and the Americans actually getting along about something, and that is we're going to band together, we and the British, to keep all of these guys out while Latin America is declaring their independence, because we want to keep this as our sphere of influence, and that's what the Monroe Doctrine is all about. Okay, so the deal is then is that you've got Argentina and Chile and Peru and Colombia and Mexico that are going to become independent, and the United States is going to recognize them, while the United States also begins to find ways to utilize these territories. Okay, what are some things that happen as Americans are moving westward and need to find better ways to communicate and also to move around this large country that's being settled? First of all, sailing ships are awesome, but sailing ships are too slow. Going up and down the rivers of the United States and into the lakes and all that, sailing ships are cheap, but they're extremely unreliable as far as time frame. I want you to imagine ordering something on Amazon.com and being told that you will get it somewhere from 3 to 7 months, and no other details are provided because nobody knows. It all depends on how the sailing ship does, how the wind is blowing, what kind of repairs the ship needs during its trip, right? There is no set mechanical time frame here. And this was bad too. America didn't have lots of roads up east of the Mississippi. It had lots of rivers that it used as roads. And so if you wanted to go upstream against the currents of any of the rivers, you had to tie your boats to donkey or horse or oxen trains that would take you a couple miles a day up that river. So slow, just horribly slow. So in 1807, one of the biggest revolutionary changes in the market that happens is right here. This is a steamship called the Clermont, and that's spelled correctly, Clermont, and it's invented by Robert Fulton. Robert Fulton is not the inventor of the steamship. He's just the first one to make it marketable in the United States. Now, they were already somewhat common in Britain. And so the steamship is just taking an American riverboat and putting a steam engine on it. It's not a big one. And then, of course, paddle wheels. And it's got sails just in case, because nobody really trusted their steam engines yet. This is just too new. These engines are not all that great yet. And here's the reference. The speed of this boat is 4.7 miles per hour at maximum speed without wind. That's not so exciting, right? That's not super fast. But that's 4.7 miles an hour against the wind, with the wind, during the daytime, at night, during the rain. It doesn't matter what's happening. The tide could be coming or going. You still can make at least 4.7 miles an hour because you've got a motor attached to paddle wheels, which sailing boats, they have to stop and wait or get tied up to things like this to go somewhere. All right. So this is actually really lightning quick for 1807. That's the beginning of the steamship revolution. You're going to see the same engine that was used on the Clermont put on this by 1830, and you're going to see the birth of the American railroad system. And the engine, by the way, this is the engine right here. This is the actual engine, the whole engine. This is the boiler that you put fire into and heat up the water. The water's up here. And then the steam off-gassing is right here. And then this engine simply has a piston that you put steam in. It goes boom, and then boom, and then boom, and then boom. And there's this piston that gets pushed up and down by that steam. So up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. And it's connected to this wheel, which is geared up to this wheel, and therefore the thing moves. It's really a simple and somewhat elegant design for what it is. Not super powerful, but this was a practice run. If it's worth money, if this is going to work, then you're going to see these things get bigger and bigger as people invest in better technology. So how does it go? Well, within 15 years, you see trains like this with much bigger engines. The engines right here and right here, much bigger engines, right? And so 1827, the very first, that's the Tom Thumb, that's completed in 1830. And it's connecting. You'll notice a theme here. Baltimore, the city of Baltimore with all the people in it and the farming land of Ohio. Why do you do this? Because you need to get people who live way out in the hinterlands of Ohio, you need to get their food to waiting mouths and deep pockets, right? People with money who need food. And so you put a train there and you can get fresh food to them much quicker. Right here, New England states, the very old built up states with lots of big cities and towns in them, and you're connecting railroads at this point to Kentucky and Indiana, farming territories, right? By 1850, you've got 9,000 miles of railroad track, the U.S. world leader, U.S. is the world leader. And by the end of the American Civil War, 35,000 miles of railroad track. That's just amazing stuff, right? So this is before the Civil War. Here we are by 1890. So this is the Wild West era. Here we are before the Civil War, all the way up through 1865. And here we are 15 years after the Civil War is over. 15 years, guys, after the Civil War is over, and we're looking at this, which is why when we say that the American Industrial Revolution really took off after the Civil War, I think that's pretty evident when you look at this, right? And this connects all these farming lands right here with all the big cities right here, and connects across the continent people that live in places like San Francisco, LA, and San Diego. So that's really something else. This shows you how the railroads were such a big deal, as was immigration, because from China, you've got labor coming to build this whole section. And from Ireland and Italy, you've got people building all of this. Okay. So some examples of more in technologically advanced steamships that go on the open ocean instead of just rivers, right? You've got these ferry boats across big bays like San Francisco and New York. Similar like this, large river boats carrying cargoes and passengers. And then, of course, you've got lots of accidents, because this was also a period of time where there was zero regulation of new technology. So this kind of event, like the burning of the General Slocum, these events happen pretty often. Anywhere in the country, there was, on any given day, there was a report of some horrible disaster. But just like airline flights, there were more successful flights or trips on steamboats, for instance, than there were disasters. So we have that. How about the geographic breakup? Northeast and the Great Lakes, right here. That's New England all the way over to, say, Michigan, okay? And thereabouts. Textiles, you're going to see people turning southern cotton into cloth that folks will buy for all kinds of things, right? You see the manufacturing of steam engines to help do all this work. You see coal mining happening up in the north mostly, although you'll see some in Virginia too. And you'll see the production of iron and steel that helps to create things like the railroads, and that's all up in the north and the northwest. Midwest and the frontier and the south, agriculture and mining mostly, okay? So the Midwest and the south. So that's farming and for food and cotton, and also for minerals, right? And then you put these two together and you've got consumerism. It's a rise of industry that created a great deal of wealth, which means you've got the creators of industry, the entrepreneurs at the top, building things to make products. And then you've got the labor at the bottom, often immigrants, sometimes slave, that are basically doing the hard labor, which is the coal mining, the manufacturing, the iron and steel production, right? All that stuff, okay? And then there's going to be this new class called the middle class. So you're going to see the idea of there being educated and degreed even middle class people who manage businesses for the owners of those businesses. Okay. The other thing that these guys do is they actually make everybody pretty wealthy, because by being middle class, you've got a bigger paycheck than the labor class. And that bigger paycheck allows you to buy products. Those products are all being made by these guys. Okay. So that's part of what we call an economy. And that middle class is going to be a huge part of the consumer economy. To give you some examples of this middle class's growth and some ideas of who they were, you've got people living in homes that have decorations in them, unlike the labor class and immigrant labor, and even farms of the old days. You've got libraries with lots and lots of books in them, because people are publishing and printing books like crazy. You've got people homeschooling, which was very common on the frontier. You've got gender roles obviously exist in this picture. You've got this kind of thing, American Woman's Home, which are books that went out to help teach middle-class women who can read how to be better wives and homemakers. All right, these are books like this one, The Lady's Book of Manners. This is a very middle-class thing of the period. How to become a perfect lady, love, courtship, and marriage, how to talk correctly, polite and accurate conversation and pronunciation, common errors corrected, how to read, and a guide to the art of composition and punctuation, right? How to be the perfect lady. There's books like this for men as well, for boys, men, and girls and women. This is fun. Ladies, on the issue of true politeness, never introduce persons to each other without a knowledge that it will be agreeable to both parties. This may sometimes be ascertained without a formal question. Very great intimacy with and knowledge of each party may be a sufficient assurance that the introduction will be agreeable. The inferior should always be introduced to the superior. Ladies, take precedence of gentlemen. You will represent ... The deal is that these are all manners that exist in the wealthy classes. And the middle class is getting a little bit of money by working in all these industries as management. And what's happening is they're taking money home and they're copying the wealthy class, okay, by making their own rules. And so there's even more of these where you see women and men taught how they should act in public, almost like a Jane Austen book of rules. All right, more images like this, people with pets and kids, wealthy, not wealthy, I'm sorry, but decent quality clothing on, the business clothes that are modeled after the rich people's clothes. This is more like the Target version instead of the Nordy's version. All right, you've got a little bird up here. You've got luxury. This is actually luxury for a non-wealthy family, but a middle-class family, which is a lot wealthier than what the middle class used to be when we get to this market revolution period. We come here and we see the images of women doing work in the home. This one is preparing food. And this one here is, I think, also preparing food. I think she's got a rolling pin, right? And you've got this big fireplace that also served as a way to cook all that food as well. Schoolhouses. You could put this, it's just the same image. You could put this in this little sort of virtual reality headset kind of thing that people made back in the 1800s, and it would be 3D. And so that was kind of cool. Something that you could do back then. All right, so this is a good example of a schoolhouse that middle-class people could send their kids to, so their kids would have the opportunities to go and work for the wealthy owners of businesses and make some money better than, say, the labor class could do. All right, here's everybody in these schoolhouses being taught whatever they're being taught, right? They look very excited to be there. All right, this is the beginning, this early 1800s era, the cult of domesticity and true womanhood. Piety, purity, submission, domesticity. How a woman should act as part of polite society of the new middle class. This sort of thing still exists in some places in this country, and it definitely existed in the wealthy classes for quite a long time. Piety, believed to be a more religious, or women were believed to be more religious and spiritual than men. Purity, pure in heart, mind, and body, women were supposed to be. Submission, women were held in perpetual childhood where men dictated all actions and decisions. This is very true. Domesticity, a division between work and home encouraged by the Industrial Revolution. Men went out to the world to earn a living, and home became where the woman controlled everything. She raised the children and taught the morals and dealt with the neighbors and created a nice home for the husband, right? That was her job. So this kind of gender role was really well advertised and taught in the 1800s. And I would say into the early 1900s. Keep in mind, women don't get the right to vote till the 1920s. So there's a reason why it took so long. It's because of this sort of very Puritan way of looking at female roles in American society. These things were sold, these were all sold by catalogs from Europe and from the East Coast, all catalogs. Neiman Marcus and Woolsworth and all that stuff, right? There's your steam machines, types of lawn care equipment, right? Farm equipment, the cotton gin that Eli Whitney will invent that's designed to take cotton and separate it out from all the seeds and grime from the earth to make cotton much easier to produce and sell. The telegraph, all designed just to put two contacts together quickly so you can make a code, the world's first form of text messaging. This one's good. Eli Whitney was also famous for this, which is that this is an era where starting in America and then expanding out, for whatever reason, Americans came up with this earlier than even the British, is the idea that you can actually have machines that are kind of hand maneuvered, but machines that can stamp out all these little pieces that go into this musket. And if you can do this, what happens is that when anybody needs a replacement piece, they can order it and it's an exact copy of that piece. Before this time, before Eli Whitney came up with this system of standardization, you had to go to weaponsmiths and have them hand make you pieces to fit, which would take forever and was very expensive. So now we're in this era where you can just order pieces and they show up and you simply install it. That's kind of a big deal when it comes to the industrial market revolution. Big steamships going across oceans by the time we get to the middle of the 1800s. And of course, people traveling across the continent in big groups of wagon trains. This is all people doing the thing called manifest destiny: expansion, growth, industry, acquisition of wealth, jobs that can pay, and moving westward, right? So I think that's it. I just wanted to do this little bit that talked a bit about westward expansion, the creation of the middle class. I'm going to go back to this one slide, just end here in case you needed to take some notes on it. Boom, right? This is really important to understand the beginning of the American working class culture. Okay, thanks a lot.